regardless of political views. People who support the government strongly, they all agree they do not want a war. The idea that the CPC, the Communist Party, people who support Xi, that they want a war is ridiculous. No, everyone agrees they do not want a war.
Let me ask you now about China's model for development outside, right? The China is also doing development aid, right, outside, and it's investing into Africa, and it is also offering to build railways in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia and connect its Belt and Road Initiative, which, by the way, the Japanese are still very salty about, because they thought they're going to be the ones building the railway system, but then China using the railway system that they copied from Japan, which is a very good thing, because Japan copied its railway systems from others, right? You copy each other, which is a smart way of development. Don't reinvent the wheel if you can just copy the wheel, right? But where do you see China's investment into the world going, and the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, I mean, this is truly game changing. I mean, it really is a historical watershed moment. And I think in the decades that come, we will, that will be very clear. We'll be able to see that. But right now, we're still kind of in the middle stages, not really the early stages, maybe the middle stages of this project. So for people who don't know, Belt and Road this year, 2023, just saw its 10th anniversary. It originally started as One Belt, One Road, and President Xi announced it in Kazakhstan in 2013, right after he became general secretary and Chinese president. And the original idea was to connect the physical infrastructure of Central Asia with East Asia to facilitate more trade. But it continued to expand, and many countries, especially in Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, even in parts of Latin America, also Russia, they wanted to get involved in this because they recognized the massive economic potential in terms of, developing their own economies and increasing trade. And we can't understand this without understanding the fact that today China is the largest trading partner of a plurality of the countries on Earth. I really need to emphasize this point, that if you look even as recently as 20 years ago, the US was still the largest trading partner of many countries, a plurality of countries, not the majority, but a plurality. Fast forward to today, China is now, including many longtime Western allies. Not only, for instance, Saudi Arabia has become China. China is now Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner, which partially explains the increasing kind of non-aligned policies of these countries in the region, like in West Asia, the so-called Middle East. But even in Europe, Germany, for instance, its largest trading partner is China, right? So as more and more countries are trading with China, you should also keep in mind that this has to do with the neoliberal policies we were discussing in the United States and the policies of deindustrialization that began in the neoliberal era in the 70s and really accelerating in the 80s and 90s, in which the government essentially encouraged, the US government encouraged many companies to move abroad where they could have much higher profits because they can exploit much lower paid labor with fewer labor protections, and they weren't unionized, right? It was a way of also breaking the back of the powerful unions in the US, especially the UAW, the United Auto Workers unions that were very powerful in heavy manufacturing. So as many of those jobs went abroad, the US deindustrialized, its economy became much more financial and service sector oriented, which means that it increased further the US trade deficit. The US has a massive current account deficit, which means it for decades has imported significantly more than it exported. And that includes a lot of technologies and consumer goods. And China became the factory of the world. If you look at UN data from UNIDO, China is now the world's largest manufacturing power by far, representing around 31% of global manufacturing production value added, whereas the US represents only around 15%, half of China. And China, of course, produces everything. I mean, when I was growing up, I remember in the 1990s, there were all these racist stereotypes about China just producing little toys and trinkets and stuff, right? And there was a lot of exaggeration and Orientalism, but there is a grain of truth in the sense that a lot of the production was very low value added because you need to build up the infrastructure and the so-called human capital, right? The technological capabilities and and the training in order to make more advanced machines, right? Advanced technology. Well, China is now at the point where it is on the cutting edge of certain technologies, especially renewable energy, which is very important because it also goes hand in hand with the Belt and Road Initiative. Because not only, as you mentioned, is China building ports and roads and trains, including high speed rail, but also it's investing very heavily in renewable energy, not only domestically but in other countries for the green transition. And really, the green transition is going to be possible because of Chinese innovation in making, not only developing, but making solar and wind power much more affordable. And in some cases, even more competitive than oil and gas, right? So,
Mhm.
what we now see is that this is why the US has been resorting to these, very aggressive tech war policies. It's been referred to in the mainstream media in the US as a technological war. We had the trade war that started under Trump. Now we have a tech war where the Biden administration has been imposing many sanctions targeting tech companies in China, like Huawei. That started under Trump.
Yeah.
But not only Huawei, now, for instance, SMIC, which is the main partially state owned semiconductor manufacturing chip maker, to prevent the competitiveness with the Taiwanese competitors. So the point is that China is now in certain industries neck and neck or even ahead of many of the U.S. firms. So this is also, it goes hand in glove with this. But anyway, the last point I want to make on this issue of Belt and Road is that not only is this important in terms of helping to provide infrastructure for developing countries that have wanted infrastructure but have not been able to get it because in many cases, if they were trying to get loans, for instance, from the World Bank, well, we know the history of the World Bank demanding political conditionalities, including these neoliberal policies like privatization of state-owned enterprises, including cutting social protections and subsidies, etc. But furthermore, in what's not as well known is in the past few decades, especially because of the so-called lost decades of the 80s and 90s, where in the 80s many of the countries like in Latin America, and in the 90s many of the countries in Southeast Asia that had taken on many of these loans, and then especially in the 80s when the U.S. began aggressively raising interest rates, their currencies devalued against the dollar, and it became prohibitively expensive to service that debt denominated in dollars. And many of these countries, like Mexico and Argentina and Brazil, went through debt crises. In the 90s, there was a somewhat similar situation in Southeast Asia in 1997 that started in Thailand and several other countries with the Southeast Asian debt crisis. But the point is that there are these series of financial crises. And what happened is that in the past 20 years, a lot of developing countries, instead, because they were skeptical of the Bretton Woods institutions, they began borrowing a lot in international capital markets. And that meant that if you sell sovereign bonds in capital markets, then you don't have the political conditionalities that the IMF and the World Bank will impose on you. But it also means that your loans are not concessional. They're at market rates, which means they're higher interest rates. It also means that they tend to be less favorable in terms of the periods. They tend to be much shorter term loans. And the people, it's not even loans. I mean, it's sovereign debt. So you have to pay back those bondholders. And that means that it's much more difficult to extend the period, to renegotiate. So it presents its own different set of problems, which means that many of these countries are now much more conservative in their infrastructure development. So China comes along and says, we will give you very favorable loans at much longer terms, which with concessional rates that are below market value. And a recent study, for instance, I study especially Latin America, their development projects. And if you look, for instance, at Argentina, which is the kind of poster child of these IMF just debt traps, and also, Argentina is the world's largest IMF debtor, but it's also the majority of its debt is actually not owed to the IMF. It's actually owed to international bondholders, including U.S. asset managers like BlackRock, for instance, right? So the point is you look at Argentina's case and you look at all of the different institutions that offered loans to Argentina, by far the lowest interest rates were offered by China and also Brazil.
Mm.
And some of the highest interest rates were from the market, and IMF interest rates are basically in the middle. The point is that China offered a lot of very favorable conditions on these loans, And it was done through institutions like not only Chinese banks, but also the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was created as an alternative basically to the World Bank, and also the so-called Asian Development Bank that is dominated by the US and Japan, right? The point is that China began offering these much more favorable loans for infrastructure projects. And I think that's also important because another key element of this is not only is it connecting trade and moving the center of the global economy away from this transatlantic trade of
Mhm.
Europe and the US, and it's moving it back toward Asia, which is where it had been historically, considering that around half of the global population is in Asia, right? But in addition to that, something else that we should consider is that China, by doing this, it's also a way in which China can invest its massive trade surplus that it has, its capital account, its current account, excuse me, its current account surplus. China can invest that instead of investing it in U.S. Treasury securities, which is what it had done for several decades, which helps to finance the U.S. government, and that's what many countries do. They hold the majority of their foreign exchange reserves in U.S. Treasury securities, which is U.S. government debt. Instead, China was recycling a lot of that surplus that it produced through its massive current account surplus, trade surplus. It was recycling that into infrastructure development. So you actually have tangible creation of this infrastructure, which does help develop countries. But also, of course, China benefits because it has new trading partners and it's easier for China to get access to new markets and to have this reciprocal relationship instead of relying entirely on the US market. Because especially now as the US talks about decoupling, China is looking for more trade partners to ensure this economic security so it's not heavily reliant on the West anymore.
Yeah. So one question and then one observation that I want to add here is that do you know what the currency is that it's what is that that aid denominated in? Because I think one of the biggest misunderstandings in the entire world of finance, economics, and geopolitics is to think that debt is debt. There's very different kinds of debt, and if you just again Argentina and Japan has like nearly 300% debt to GDP, and it doesn't effing matter. It doesn't matter because it's all denominated 95 or 96% in Japanese yen. And as long as your debt is denominated in your own sovereign currency, you cannot go bankrupt because you can literally print the stuff yourself, which they don't do. I mean, you have other
And in
mechanisms.
the
You don't
case of
actually.
Japan,
Argentina is
over
denominated in
half of
dollars.
that debt. Yeah, and in the case of Japan, over half of that debt is owned by state institutions, including the central bank.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
mean, it is a lot of debt, but it's debt that it owes to a different that the treasury owns to the central bank.
And then every debt of the government is an asset in the private sector. If you cancel all that debt, if you paid it, if it was paid back, you would take out all of the liquidity of the private sector. You don't want that. You want this to circulate. This is good. What you don't want is debt in a foreign currency that you have no power over. And then when they tell you pay it back, then your currency goes down even further, and your debt becomes even higher. I mean, that is the original sin, having debt in a foreign currency. So my question then is, China's debt or China's investments, does it denominate it in renminbi or in local currency or in a basket? Do you know that?
It's a huge mixture. So there are some in yuan, there are some in local currencies, and there are a lot in dollars. It really depends. I mean, the thing is, when we talk about Belt and Road, we talk about it frequently, especially the Western media tends to talk about it in a way that it's all like President Xi is personally overseeing the Belt and Road and telling people. No, it's actually when you study how Belt and Road works, you realize that it's a very complex network with thousands of projects all around the world involving hundreds of different institutions, right? So it's not like this centrally planned project at all. Like I said, it started out originally with this project that was much more about building a new Silk Road. That was the language of it, right? But that was originally called One Belt, One Road, but now it's many belts and many roads. That's why it's just the BRI now, Belt and Road Initiative. And there's so many different institutions involved. I mentioned multiple Chinese banks, multiple multilateral development banks like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now the BRICS Bank, which is not new, but it's now increasing its investments as well. That's the New Development Bank, which is popularly known as the BRICS Bank, and the new president of the BRICS Bank is Dilma Rousseff, who was the former president of Brazil from the Workers' Party. So now they're also involved in Belt and Road and funding new projects. And in their case, they're heavily emphasizing the need to finance these projects with local currencies. So it's very complex, and there are some good resources online, including in Western universities like Johns Hopkins University,
Mm.
and the scholar Deborah Browdingham, who's a mainstream U.S. scholar at Johns Hopkins University, right, which is very close to the U.S. State Department, but she has done really good work, and she's a very objective scholar, and she has shown that this is not debt trap diplomacy. That she wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine saying it's actually a complete lie. China is not trapping countries in debt. And if you look at some of her data sets that she's built up, you realize that this is very complicated.
Mm. No, a lot of this is projection, right? The debt trap charge. This is exactly what the West has been doing and has been trying to do all the time as a part of neocolonialism. And now they're like, oh no, the others are going to do the same. This is just as they project all of their plans onto Russia. On when they think, oh, Russia's going to do this and going to do that to Ukraine. It's like, no, they even tell you they're not. They're after something else. But we can't get out of this projection phase. But maybe last question, because we are nearing the end. In your time in China, have you had this the most dangerous place still for an actual war between the US and China is Taiwan? Have you heard any creative thinking of how to resolve this? It's actually a Second World War conflict that has never been resolved. The civil war, right, between the People's Republic, the mainland, and the Republic of China, being Taiwan, right? And these two entities exist side by side. And I know that everybody wants a pacific, peaceful solution to this. I mean, in Taiwan, my Taiwanese friends tell me the worst case is a war. Best case is independence, but somewhere in the middle is like becoming part of mainland China. But most of them say like, no, worst case would be a war. So this needs to be avoided at all costs. Do you hear creative ideas for how to go there?
Well, yeah, yes. First of all, the thing that I'll stress is that everyone I've spoken with, I mean, everyone agrees that they do not want a violent conflict, a military
Good.
conflict over Taiwan. Everyone. I mean, including people who are pro-Western liberals, who are very critical of the government, but even they acknowledge, all of them acknowledge that Taiwan has always been a part of China going back many hundreds of years. You mentioned, for instance, World War II, and then 1949, when the communists took over, the revolution succeeded, and then the nationalists of the Kuomintang, they went to Taiwan. Well, what we should also not forget, Japan colonized Taiwan, and before that there was Dutch colonialism, which is why it was known as Formosa. So this is like a very important issue for everyone across the Chinese spectrum because of this history of colonialism. But in terms of, regardless of political views, people who support the government strongly, they all agree they do not want a war. The idea that the CPC, the Communist Party, people who support Xi, that they want a war is ridiculous. No, everyone agrees they do not want a war. And a lot of them actually have similar rhetoric. This is actually what's interesting, is you will see some very harsh disagreement between like I said, a lot of, in the elite academia, there are a lot of pro-Western liberals, but there are also people who are very supportive of the government, and they have a lot of harsh disagreements on many different policies, especially state-owned enterprises, the banking system, etc. But one thing that they very much agree on is Taiwan, on the need over time to have to reunite Taiwan, which has historically and is part of China and has been for hundreds of years, but reunite it politically. And they all agree on that, and no one wants a war. I mean, I know I'm repeating myself, but I just need to emphasize that this Western narrative that they want a war is ridiculous. And it's for a variety of reasons. One, it's because Taiwan is part of China historically, and they see Taiwan as their brothers, right? Like, and there's so much cross Taiwan Strait exchange, not only in terms of economics, but like so many people who go
Yeah.
across. Like
Yeah.
the professors I've spoken with are constantly going to Taiwan and back and forth. There are a lot of people who have families in the mainland, and people from Taiwan who have families in the mainland, people in the mainland who have families in Taiwan. I mean, it is like the North Korea South Korea divide. I mean, it has divided families for generations. It really is a real problem. Now, furthermore, there's also the issue of the economy. I mean, Taiwan now is very economically reliant on the mainland. Like it's
Yeah,
no longer the 1950s and 60s. Again, China has the world's largest economy, and there's a lot of trade between the mainland and Taiwan. Furthermore, it would be insane. No one wants a war. They don't want to destroy all the infrastructure of Taiwan. They want that trade relationship to continue. They don't want Taiwan to become Ukraine. Everyone can see what's happening. I mean, like the physical destruction of the Taiwanese economy would be horrible for everyone, not only for Taiwan, it would be bad for mainland China. So I just really need to emphasize that this is not something that people want. And in terms of creative ideas, I mean, most people agree that time is on China's side, that they want to wait 15, 20, 30 years, and over time, especially as China's economy continues to grow and Taiwan's economic relationship with the mainland continues to expand and they become more and more integrated economically, it's going to be natural that they become more and more integrated politically. That's the way that most people see it. And again, this is
yeah.
pretty unified across the political spectrum in China. It's one issue that really is bipartisan in China in the sense, or pluripartisan across different views. Now, that's why I also need to emphasize that it's really the U.S. It's not even Europe. You look at comments, for instance, like of Macron. Um, France sometimes tries to pretend it's more independent than it is, but Macron, he said, the issue of Taiwan is a Chinese issue. We're not getting involved in this, right? It's the U.S. that is really pushing this issue hard. And I think it's because so many people in the US recognize that time is not on their side. Time is on China's side. That, as I said, over time, they don't need a war, that Taiwan will naturally integrate further with the mainland. But if the US can encourage more separatist forces on Taiwan and send more troops, as it is doing, and sell more weapons and encourage this conflict, then eventually the US can turn Taiwan into what they refer to, US policymakers refer to as a prickly porcupine. They're the ones that want a conflict to emerge because they recognize that if they wait in the long term, this reuniting is going to happen. So in general, I think when you look at the US China, Cold War or competition or whatever you want to call it, I think a lot of the hawks in Washington recognize that time is not on their side. That's why in the short term, they want to increase tensions with China, because they recognize that if they wait too long, China will continue to grow economically and many of these political problems will naturally be resolved. But if the US pushes for a war in the short term, the goal is to try to frustrate China's economic development and plans for reuniting, and therefore, pull off the band-aid immediately instead of just allowing the band-aid to be slowly pulled off over time.
Yeah, I agree to that. I see it also strategically. The chances for things to go well if time goes by is much higher. It also needs to be emphasized. Japan has zero interest in the war. Zero. Actually, they're very worried because they will be the next ones to be pushed into the U.S. Into the war, right? Because that's then the next line of defense, and this is not clear to everybody over here, but a couple of people see. I mean, they're very worried about it. And the other thing is that the crazy thing at the moment, and I think we need to appreciate the situation, is that we have a working agreement. China is doing well. Taiwan is doing well. Cross trade is doing well. We have something that's working. What we don't have is a political agreement. We don't have one name to call it. We live in an in between world. So what we need is a way to is a framework that everybody can nod off, like in Beijing and in Taipei and in Tokyo and in Washington. Everybody can say fine, and then we just continue doing what we're doing already anyhow, because there's no war at the moment, and the chances that 30, 40, 50 years will change the conflict in a way that it can grow together naturally is very high, because one needs to also to appreciate that the conflict today is very different from what it was in 49. In 49 it was who is China. Today's conflict is who rules Taiwan, right? And the nature of the conflict has changed incredibly. So I would hope that from the Chinese side, we get creative ways for a framework to continue just what's happening at the moment. That's all we need. So if you hear anything, I would be happy to hear from that.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say that there's an election coming up in Taiwan in
Yes,
2024 that will be very consequential. And the
January.
DPP, the so-called Democratic Progressive Party, which is neither democratic nor progressive, which are very pro-West, very pro-US, and they have a lot of separatists in their leadership. They claim that they're against separatism, but I mean, they really are the separatist party. It's not inevitable that they'll win. And what's so funny is you have these weird historical ironies of the parties in Taiwan, the so-called KMT, the Kuomintang. They actually, of all the parties, are the ones that now are actually the ones that agree the most with the mainland, that they want to integrate over time, because it is one China. So there are a lot of people in Taiwan who agree with that. And I should emphasize, if you look at polls, to be fair, I'll be honest, there's not a majority of Taiwanese who want to immediately reunify with China. The vast majority with the mainland, the vast majority of people in Taiwan want the status quo.
Yeah, they're fine with the status quo
Over
because the status
80%.
quo works wonderfully. And so the question is, how do we keep the status quo alive? And was in touch with the former vice president of Taiwan, Lu Xulien, and she had several proposals. All we need is a political framework, like a one Chunghua. You remember, like, this is now not being discussed anymore, but the idea of one country, two systems, that was the kind of framework for Hong Kong. And
Well,
that
and
then
Macau,
kind of
yeah, that's still the system technically.
yeah, and this is a framework. It's a political framework that allows several communities to live together. What we need is the same for Taiwan. But I am unfortunately, yes, you're right. The U.S. is working very hard on preventing any such things from emerging, because the more people, the more troops you station, or the more agreements you get, the less likely you make this. But Ben Norton, I think I would thank you very much for the talk today, and hope to talk to you again.
Yeah, I'll just make one final comment. I know you want to wrap up, but I'll just say that this issue of Taiwan also, we I really need to emphasize that it's the U.S. that has been the one that has been encouraging these tensions. And even if you go back to the 3 communiques that the U.S. signed with China starting in 1972 in order to normalize diplomatic relations, going back to 1979 and the Taiwan Relations Act and the second communique, as soon as the U.S. officially normalized relations with the PRC, which was officially 79, it also passed the Taiwan Relations Act. So it's always had this policy of, you know, uh, one step forward, one step back, where the U.S. again will try to have its cake and eat it too, where it will, recognize supposedly the one China policy on paper, but then also at the same time reaffirm support through Taiwan and arms shipments through the Taiwan Relations Act and all these things. So it's always been a policy of what they call strategic ambiguity. And when you have strategic ambiguity, you can't have security, because by nature, with the ambiguity, you can't be secure because no one is sure what's actually going to happen. So I just wanted to emphasize that final point. And I want to thank you, Pascal, for the great conversation, the excellent questions, and the good work that you do.
Thank you very much, Ben. People can find you on Geopolitical Economy Report. Sorry, I always
Yeah,
get it wrong.
yeah.
The
You can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com, and
Mhm.
people can find all the links there. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can go to Geopolitical Economy Report and subscribe.
And I encourage everybody to do that. Thank you, Ben, and talk to you next time.
My pleasure.